The U.S. has an interceptor program to allegedly intercept a long-range ballistic missile. I'm not talking about short range or even medium range, long range, like that would come from Russia or North Korea. 44 interceptor missiles. 4 of them are at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Santa Barbara. 40 of them are at Fort Greely in Alaska. 44. So if Russia has 1,670 nuclear weapons, how are our 44 interceptors going to go up against those? It is like trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet. That's a quote from the spokesperson at the Pentagon. One of them is traveling at 14,000 miles an hour, the ballistic missile, 14,000 miles an hour. The interceptor, the little kinetic vehicle inside of it that's going to hit the warhead, hopefully, is traveling at 20,000 miles an hour. That's where you get the trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. And by the way, this is all happening 500 miles up in space. Intellectually, you know, as an investigative journalist, it was just, what's the next page? No matter how nuclear war begins, it ends in 72 minutes and 5 billion people would be dead.
Do you think there will be a nuclear war?
So I've interviewed former secretaries of defense, the former nuclear sub-commander, the Secret Service. And what I learned was, oh my God.
Annie Jacobsen, investigative researcher and writer who specializes in uncovering the world's biggest secrets.
We are one misunderstanding away from nuclear apocalypse. And yet you have presidents threatening nuclear war. In fact, the President of the United States doesn't need to ask anyone to launch a nuclear missile.
It makes me realize how important the decision to pick our leaders is.
Nothing could be more important.
Could you play out a scenario where nuclear war broke out?
Yes, and I can describe in painstaking, horrific detail precisely what happens. But after nuclear war, the survivors would be forced to live underground and envy the dead.
Annie, is there anyone you interviewed that brought you to tears?
Yes, I met a woman who is a survivor of the Nagasaki bomb. And I haven't written about this yet. But someone I interviewed and someone that meant a lot to me wired that nuclear weapon that was dropped on Nagasaki.
Can you speak about the impact that it had on both those individuals?
And it's horrifying.
How do you feel about the nature of the? It's interesting as well because when you think about the books you've written, I think how many have you written now? 6 or 7?
7.
7 books in total. The subject matter of your books are all the basis of a lot of conspiracy theory, if that makes sense. You know, you've written about Area 51 and this thing called Operation Paperclip and the Pentagon and now nuclear bombs and the CIA, all these kinds of things, which are the basis of many of the conspiracy theories that I hear about. So you've got a very unique perspective on the world because you've had the privilege and the access of interviewing some of the most interesting people that are closest to these very interesting subjects. What are some of the things that you've come to learn that you once thought were just conspiracy theories?
I mean, conspiracy theory is such a loaded word, and I think it's too bad that it's used as a catch-all to kind of dismiss a lot of curiosity. Because curiosity is important, right? And curiosity leads toward reading. I mean, I couldn't be a bigger fan of reading or listening to educating yourself. I mean, things have really changed in terms of audio. Like you can listen to a podcast and learn a lot. You can listen to an audiobook the same way that you used to have to read them. And so to just call things conspiracy theories, I find to be intellectually thin, right? It's just too easy. And it's also very self-righteous. And I think 2 things I always work to avoid is like kind of being a know-it-all. And I am around a lot of know-it-alls because people who become experts in subjects and maybe they don't get as much attention as they think they deserve tend to become a little bit of self-righteous know-it-alls. And so I have to wind my way through that world because what interests me are subjects that make me ask the question, why, right? Like, why does no one know about Area 50? Why is Area 51 so secret? I mean, when I wrote the book Area 51, the word Area 51 was still classified.
Really?
You couldn't say it. I went to the CIA and I was told by my minder, if you say a certain word and number, you will be asked to leave. It was classified. It only became unclassified when President Obama spoke about it publicly.
Oh, really?
He just mentioned it, and then it was unclassified, right? And so, to answer your question, I find it really interesting tackling subjects that are in the zeitgeist, that people are interested in, and then trying to unpack the truths and the fictions.
But is there something you heard about, you heard a whisper about, and you thought that can't possibly be true? And then after doing a little bit of investigative researching and journalism, you discovered that it actually was true and you were blown away. And I say that in part because I lived much of my life thinking that a lot of these subjects, Area 51, the CIA, this idea that there's all these spies and they're doing all of this stuff. And I thought a lot of it was just internet rumors and, certain people who have, they have like the silver foil on their heads and they're just like, whatever. And then I had the privilege of speaking to some people on this podcast and just out there in the world who confirmed that a lot of the things I once thought were tinfoil hat stuff is actually true. And once you have the curtain pulled back, it kind of blows your mind open to what else could be true. And I'm a person that kind of like needs evidence and logic, and I'm not going to believe something because I saw it on like an Instagram post or a story or a Telegram community. But my mind's been blown, especially over the last couple of years, about how some of these things that people consider to be conspiracy theories are actually very true. Have you had those moments in your career?
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, you can really drill down on this stuff and figure out the thematic element of what's going on and then the specifics. And I'll give you an example. Like in Area 51, I learned about something called strategic deception, which is a CIA concept, okay? And this plays into conspiracy theories. And when you come across something, maybe having this information I'm about to tell you will help you go, okay, let me look at it in terms of these two lanes. So it goes like this. The CIA was building spy planes out at Area 51. The U-2 spy plane, which was going to spy on the Soviet Union in the 50s from above and figure out whether they were preparing for nuclear war. And the plane was built at Area 51 because no one could know about it. It flew at 70,000 feet. It was out of range of any surface-to-air missiles. I interviewed the first man who flew over the Soviet Union in a U-2, Hervey Stockman. And he took pictures with these massive CIA cameras that, came back to the agency. It was wet film and allowed the CIA to understand what was actually going on the ground in Soviet Russia. It was photographing military bases. So the spy plane was being built and it was so secret, like only the president knew about it. At the same time, nuclear weapons were being exploded next door, right? So Area 51 and then over at Area 23 was where the bombs were going off. And I was interviewing all the engineers who were building the spy plane. And Bob Murphy was one of the lead engineers, and he told me this story about strategic deception. So he and others would go to the ranch, that's what they called Area 51, then they'd fly back to Burbank, California, where they all lived for the weekends to be with their families. And they would take this shuttle back and forth. And one day, they went to a big party the night before, and Bob Murphy got drunk. He was not a guy who gets drunk, but he got drunk. He missed the shuttle. And he was like, oh my God, I'm gonna lose my job. I'm in trouble. And he opens the doors, how he described it to me, to go out and deal with this. And there's an FBI agent about to knock on the door. And the guy turns white as a ghost because Bob Murphy was supposed to be on that flight, so he was on the flight manifest, and it crashed into Mount Charleston on the way there, and everyone was dead. Okay? So that is just a dramatic thing to begin with, but here's how it ties up with strategic deception. The CIA learns that its aircraft full of U-2 engineers, designers, all these incredibly important people on this top secret project are dead. They just crashed into Mount Charleston. What are they going to do? How are they going to keep this secret? All the news stations are racing up to the top of the mountain to try to get to the crash site. Oh my God, the project's going to be blown open. What are we going to do? So they quickly rope off the areas. They do the damage control to the best that they can. But they're spinning, and I have all the declassified documents from that part of it, learning how worried they are. There's almost no doubt the project's going to be revealed. The U-2 program is going to be no more because once the Soviets know about it, it's off. And instead, the press comes up with a story. The press reports that it's all these atomic scientists working on this secret new weapon. They just completely make this up in essence, right? It's this new weapons project. And that's what they're all doing. Who knows who put what bug in someone's ear? And so that's the story that comes out. And the CIA is like, perfect. And the story explains that there are two kinds of strategic deception. There's cover, when you say, like Bob Murphy said to his wife, I'm just an engineer working out there on some television systems. That's cover. That was his cover. He didn't say I'm working on the U-2 spy plane. And then there's disinformation. When the press reports that the crash was full of a bunch of atomic engineers working on a secret weapons program. And those are both kinds of strategic deception. And so you begin to realize that there is a purpose behind a lot of information coming out into the public. And the CIA often uses that to its advantage. And so whenever a situation happens, you have to say to yourself, is this really what happened? Or is it covering up something else? And then, of course, you have to put your rational person hat on. And you can't just imagine what the true story might be. You have to actually find it and report it.
Does the CIA, I think in the UK it's called MI5 or MI6, MI6 I think is the equivalent. Does MI6, all of these sort of special secret service agencies around the world, do they work with the media?
That's a totally separate podcast. We could talk forever because there's history of the CIA. And I'm not an expert on foreign intelligence agencies as much as I am on the United States. But by all means, there's a long history of the CIA working with journalists, reporters, authors to put information there. I mean, there's almost nothing that the CIA hasn't done, to my eye. The question is, reporting it in the context of how that's happening. I write about in The Pentagon's Brain, if you want a little homework, and you go into the back and in the index and look up brainwashing. And there's a long story where I explain exactly how this happened in the 50s with what ultimately an element that became known as the MK Ultra program. Okay, so like MK Ultra was a real program and it had a lot of sinister components to it. Is it everything that, certain groups of people that sometimes get called conspiracy theorists say that it was? No, but there are threads of truth in it. And if you reverse engineer the brainwashing concept from the back, you will see what I'm talking about. And I think it's a very interesting story because it actually involves the head of the CIA, a guy called Allen Dulles, and his son, who got brain damaged in Korea, whom I tracked down and interviewed for that book. Spoiler alert.
What happens?
Which part? I mean, which part?
I'm so compelled by the whole idea of the CIA because we had someone here recently talking. We had Andrew here recently talking about what goes on at the CIA, and I think one of the things he said to me is that the role of the CIA has changed over time, and once upon a time it was more capable of doing more things. And by the way he described it, it sounded like the CIA has less powers and can do less of the things that it's been accused of in the past. I think it's been accused of killing the president here by some people, or being involved in the assassination of one of the presidents here. And does the CIA report directly into the president?
The CIA features in almost every one of my books. The most sort of comprehensive look I did at the CIA was a book called Surprise, Kill, Vanish, which is about the CIA's paramilitary. And once I reported that, I understood that there are actually two very distinct components of the CIA. There's the sort of central intelligence agency, the primary human. It's called human intelligence, and there's analysts, and there's espionage, and then there's the paramilitary organization, which was set up in 1947 specifically to go against the Russian version of itself, sort of to do the darkest, dirtiest, nastiest operations that we had to because the Russians were. And so, you know, the CIA is a giant organization with a lot of tentacles. And I think it's important to speak, at least for me, having reported on many of these different programs. You know, Area 51 covers the aerial espionage element of the CIA, the science and technology. The CIA was responsible for putting the first satellite in space, the Corona program. Dr. Bud Whelan, who I interviewed for Area 51, remarkable intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance programs. And then you have the paramilitary operators, the trigger pullers, the snake eaters, the individuals who, you know, find, fix, and finish people. That's a euphemism. The teams that do that. But I prefer to speak very specifically on programs because I find it's the most responsible or the most factual way for me to stick to a certain lane of the agency because it is so
on the nuclear war subject. We talked a little bit about another thing that has, I kind of alluded to it, that has emerged since you started writing this book, which is the conversation around artificial intelligence. And when I start thinking about how you overlay that with this idea of nuclear war, it becomes even more concerning because we're heading towards a world of what they call artificial general intelligence, where a lot of these systems will be making autonomous decisions. Mm-hmm. They'll be able to, and a couple of people that I've spoken to from DeepMind or from Google have talked to me about a world where, this is an extreme case, but our elected leaders will be either AI themselves or being basically working in lockstep with AI. And then when you think about our nuclear weapon systems, who is better to make that decision? Is it a Joe Biden that's better to make a decision to launch a nuclear weapon? Or is it some kind of artificial intelligence that is so advanced we might not even know what it's thinking or doing? Have you thought much about artificial intelligence since this book came out and since you started writing?
Absolutely. It's something I covered at length in The Pentagon's Brain, which is the book about DARPA. And I think that maybe I'll speak to an origin story here, right? Because I think of Shakespeare, it's like what is past is prologue. We can understand better the question you raise, especially for younger people, like what is this going to look like in the future? Is a president really going to be working in consort with AI? If we know, wait, how did this all begin? It somehow, at least to my eye, becomes easier to think about these things in a grounded manner. And so I'll throw this detail at you. In reporting The Pentagon's Brain, it was fascinating to learn that during World War II, computers were people. A computer was someone who computed mathematical, trajectories, bomb explosions were all measured by people and pencils. And right, so then, and I love the smile because suddenly it all becomes easier. Then you have a guy called John von Neumann, the Pentagon's brain. He was the first brain that the Pentagon really was interested in. And he created one of the first computers. You can't really assign the first computer to anyone, but there was a computer that was doing calculations called ENIAC. And ultimately, after the war, von Neumann went to the Atomic Energy Commission, the most powerful organization in the world at the moment, and said, I want to build a computer that can actually think for itself. He's kind of the progenitor of this idea of software, not just hardware. So for a long time, it was kind of Texas Instruments type computing, almost just like a giant calculator. And von Neumann wanted to put the brain inside the calculator. And they gave him a lot of money to do it. And he did this in the basement of Fould Hall over at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Study. And it was giant vacuum tubes. And he would do these tests. And I describe this in The Pentagon's Brain because it's really interesting to think this was only in 1945. There were vacuum tubes and, cords, and they had to worry about mice eating cords. And John von Neumann was so brilliant and smart that he could beat the computer initially. His assistants would give him numerical calculations. He would do them in his mind. The computer would be trying to do them. He would win. And then one day, in I think it was 1946 or 1947, the computer beat him.